Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on web accessibility. In the next 25 minutes, me and my colleague Ankit Rathi will be talking around some few basic pointers on what is accessibility, why do we need to bother about web accessibility as people, as developers, and as businesses, why it is important for us to focus on this topic. And then the end would be more around how do we implement it, the subtle things that you can keep in mind as a developer, as a designer, as a content writer, to ensure that you are enabling accessibility for everything that we develop around us, right? Now let's start with I wanted to showcase one of the websites that I had recently developed. It's using the cutting edge technology, anything that you can think of in terms of the latest and greatest tech stack. It has the most refined CI/CD pipeline that is set up. It uses cloud computing, and this is what you see. I hope you love it, right? From interactivity standpoint, the animations that are baked in. Well, you're not this is not a broken site. It is not a blank screen that you're seeing by accident. But this is what a visually challenged person will be able to see from a website standpoint. No matter how jazzy, how crazy you create it, if it's not accessible, it is as good as not having one, right? Now with that as a base, I would also want to take a journey, a little back in time, along with you guys, where I was still in college, and I used to write exams for my visually challenged seniors. And it was intriguing to see them, move around the college with the confidence that they had, the limitations of we as a society, how we make things difficult for our, visually challenged, disabled colleagues, and how they were able to find their way around it, and having these interactions while writing those exams for them. It was intriguing to learn their day-to-day way of dealing with all the challenges that we threw at them, right? And I had back then pledged that I'll make sure that whatever I do, I'll at least keep my prime attention on making sure that I whatever I build will be uniform for everyone to use, so to say, right? Cut to our corporate life with the deadlines, with the pressures. All those thoughts kind of became a back burner till not so long back, when as part of the sports committee, we organized a video gaming session for our colleagues within Sapient, right? We sent out an email, and I promptly got a reply back which looked like this, right? It said, the following mailer is not readable to me. I'm a person with blindness, and the information in the emailer seems to be an image. Could you add text? And that's when it really hit us really hard that we so often take things for granted. We just assume that if we are able to see things a certain way, everybody else would be able to do the same. It would hit me all the more. I'll tell you the reason why. Me taking things for granted hit me even harder than what it would to conventionally other developers. There's a story for the upcoming slides, but that's the impact that this emailer had. That I pledged that going forward, I'll make sure that I spread the message of accessibility and awareness wherever I go. Right. With that, let's try and understand a little more on what does accessibility really mean. If you go by the textbook definition of wiki says, right, it basically says it's the ability to access. And to think of it, that is what it really is. Making sure that whatever is accessible to a normal, visually, able person should be able to be accessed by anybody with the same effort, effortless and ease, so to say, right? Let's break this down even further, right? Now, if you look at accessibility for the web, right, it is broadly broken down into three primary segments. One is design, one is code, the third is content. Now, what does each of these really mean? Let's do a deep dive in each one of them. Well, before we proceed, even trying to get down to these three specific elements, let's spend a little more time understanding why is it important for businesses to understand what accessibility is, and why is it important for them to implement accessibility. For that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Ankit, who's going to take us forward with the why part of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sailesh, for explaining what is accessibility. Now you have spoken about what it is. Let me talk about why we are talking about accessibility, why it is even necessary to talk about accessibility. and why it should be an immediate consideration when you are designing a web application. So it's all start when you are building, or I can say maintaining already built application. No matter what kind of application it is, it could be an e-commerce application, it could be a grocery application, or it could be related to social media, where you are trying to reach the maximum number of users. No matter what target audience for your application, like homemaker, office going people, there is always a section of audience which is fundamentally not able to use your application as a normal user does. If we talk about what kind of accessibility users we can expect on a very broad level, there are three categories of especially abled people. The first one is permanent, like a blind person. The second one is temporary, a person with broken wrist and he cannot use mouse and keyboard at the same time. The third one is conditional. So suppose you are in a noisy place, like in a party or a crowded place, at that time you can't listen to anything else. Let's try to understand these accessibility users. WHO report says there are around 300 million visually challenged people and 460 million people has disabling hearing loss. And if we include temporary and conditional, then this becomes a very large number. As per research, 5 to 6 out of every 100 users are finding it difficult to use a given website. If I say any site, then I mean it, because there is only 1% of websites that meet accessibility standards. Only 1% as per W3C. So you can imagine how bad we are. These users are struggling to use the web in general, and it should be one of the major priority area for every online business. Let's have a look at the spend capacity of these accessibility users, so that you can easily understand what is the market segment you are going to lose, or I say the market segment you can cover by taking and adopting accessibility seriously. According to the Road Group research, worldwide, this market is in trillion, 6 trillion approximately. You can understand how big this market share is. And with the family and friend of these especially able people, this market share increased to around 8 trillion. I'm not saying that the 6 trillion or 8 trillion is going to burn business, but if we look at the overall e-commerce business, then $6 trillion is what fundamentally expecting to lose if you do not adopt accessibility. Now let's look at how this impacts business. While the end goal is all financial, because everything translates to business, if I break down this business or financial aspect, it is broadly categorized into two buckets. One is the brand itself, and the other one is the legal dependency and legal implication that comes when you are not accessibility compliance. Let's look at the very different dimension. Here we have 6 logos from some top brands. What do you think these brands have common? Any idea? Like to our food brand, one is a retailer or online media channel, a branded watch company, and one is the giant in mobile and computer segment. Apart from the fact that they have a common e-commerce present, the other common part is they have been sued at a given point of time. Why? Because they have not been accessibility compliant and they had to spend millions and thousands to settle their accessibility cases. So we can say legal implication also have a financial impact. Let's talk about some numbers which are increasing every year. As you can see, these are the numbers of lawsuits that have been filed in the US. These are not just regular lawsuits. These are lawsuits in the US for accessibility alone. In the last 2 years, these lawsuits have suddenly spiked. Why? Because web users have increased significantly. In the last 2 years, it has crossed 2,000, almost double from previous years. Why? Because especially able people are now aware and they expect the same behavior from your site as a normal user would. So a spike in web users is a good sign for online business, but the spike in lawsuit and for accessibility is not a good sign. It is a clear indication or a warning for site that you must take accessibility seriously and it should be on your priority. As we have seen here, legal challenges impact any brand financially. It also impacts brand image, which turn to a reduction of business. Brand advantages using accessibility also as important as legal. The first one is providing equal access beyond disability is a social responsibility for every company, and it helps to increase sight image between especially able people and their loved one. So let's understand with an example. So I'm looking for a running shoes and I visit a particular brand site because my family member is using that one. It is their favorite one. I found compatible shoes for me, but I could not find my favorite one. Why? Because I'm colorblind, and for me, two or three color look same. So I don't know I will receive the same color or not. So I visit the Nike site, which is my favorite one, and I found they have clearly called out this is red color, this is purple color. So I can easily understand what I should select and order. Where I will share my experience with my loved one and friends in my circle, then first brand again going to lose their reputation and brand image. Here mouth publicity will also work for brand Nike. We should also think about the human part of it. There is a certain set of people and they are expecting from you to provide same service to them so they can feel like a normal human being. So now to understand how accessibility work and how we can achieve accessibility standards, I hand over to Sailesh again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankit, for explaining why is it important for businesses to consider accessibility as one of the key elements that they need to deliver every time they enhance their website even further, right? Now let's come back to where we left off. The three key elements of design, code, and content, and how we can look at each of these slivers to understand how accessibility can be improved or can be considered while we are setting up the process of each of these core areas. Starting with the design itself, uh, one of the key things that we talk about design is colors, all right? And rest assured, color blindness is one of the most common, accessibility challenges that we have today. I can tell you with experience, I am personally colorblind. This is one of the tests that you have available. This is called the Ishihara test. For you, you could probably see six numbers. For me, I can probably only read 25. The rest are just different color blobs for me. And generally, people try and pretend that I can read, but unfortunately, I can't. And if it gets embarrassing, for my safety sake, I write down answers of what this actually would depict. But yeah, I can't necessarily see them, right? Now, how do you counter something like this? One of the key things that you'll need to look at when you're looking at design itself is to make sure that you're not using any color as one of the only mechanisms for somebody to identify an error or identify a particular given object on the page. Like in the first example, you would see that the telephone is marked in red. Now, a colorblind person would probably get confused if it's a red or a green, or if it's right or a wrong. So it's easier that you probably give a equally different indicator, like a star or asterisk calling, that particular field to be a required field. Similarly, in the case of graphs, it gets difficult for somebody who's colorblind to explain purely basis of colors. So if you look at it, there is a corresponding legend to it that can be called out, or in the second diagram, you would see that there is a shape associated with the color as well. Just helps understand colors a lot better for people who are colorblind. The last one, like all people say, this is something that is very common, so we'll not delve too much into it, is just to make sure that you have a high contrast ratio for any app or any screen that you develop or design. Right. Moving on, looking at content considerations. Again, there are a few things which are up there, very common. That's what I'll probably mention and move forward for this particular presentation. Just to avoid commonly used words like click here. as your link. Now, if you're looking at an e-commerce implementation, you would probably have a bunch of links that are appearing on a product listing page. And if you have click here as a link, or read more, or buy now as links for a particular person to access and navigate, or make it a call to action, in the screen reader, all the person will get to hear is click here, buy now, buy now, buy now, without knowing what necessarily he's actually buying by clicking on that link. And there are solutions to it. We'll probably get to that in the upcoming slides. The other important thing to look at is avoid using caps as content for your link. Most screen readers end up reading it letter by letter and not as a full word. Similar behavior is experienced when you use URLs directly inside the link. It would actually call out http:// something, which probably would be difficult for a person to understand what is he actually clicking on. Right. Moving on to something which we as front-end developers can definitely do to improve accessibility when we write code. One of the important things is to understand what accessibility tree is and the accessibility object model itself. Right. Now, accessibility object model is still in the draft stage. It was just initiated in August of 2020. And what it really helps do is understand the semantic relationship between elements. We'll do a deep dive on that probably in a subsequent presentation. But for now, let's understand the high-level dynamics of it. Now, this is available in the Chrome toolbar. If you go into the style segment, the last tab is generally accessibility. Now, if you look at it, this is the accessibility tree that gets generated. This is from the xtsummit.com website itself. I am on the speakers page, and I've clicked on my name and right-clicked, and this is where I get to. This basically calls out the hierarchy in which the DOM is generated, and similarly, the accessibility tree is also created. Now, there are corresponding values that you can identify and modify to understand how an accessibility tree is generally formed and behaves. Right. Now, coming on to the code part of it, if you look at assistive technology itself, right, those work on four primary elements, which is the name, role, state, and value of a particular HTML object. Let's start with the name and role. In this particular example, if you notice, there is a label which has a direct link with the input box. If you see the for attribute, it is basically mapping to the ID of the input box. And this is what is being read by the screen reader. So if you look at it, the name that it gets to the text box is actually email address, which is the label that is associated with the text box. And hence it's important for you to give the corresponding labels which are meaningful for that particular text box. You generally have people who ignore the label but have input tags as F name, L name, which kind of gets difficult for a screen reader user to interpret what is it that we are expecting the input box to be filled with. Now, if you look at the second example, where we're talking about a simple submit button, if you look at it, it comes with the other values as well, which is a role, which is a button. Needless to say, it is one of the input types. And it's also coming up with a state, which is called as disabled, because that's the value that we have provided it. Now, we'll get into the semantics part of it, but these are core values which are read by the accessibility tree. And if you were to JavaScript your way into changing the values of the state or any of these objects, if you focus on those elements again, you will find these updated values in the accessibility tree itself. Moving on, this is the other way that we were speaking about in the previous slide as to how do I associate a link with a more meaningful text. Now, if you look at it, a normal user who is able to comprehend a visual representation will be able to identify that clicking on a read here, a read more would basically give you into details of this particular headline. But I can actually link the H3 with my link by using the labeled by ARIA attribute. And if you look at the accessibility tree below, the H3 headline is directly linked to storms hit East Coast. And that is what is being read by the link that is being provided. So instead of read more, the screen reader will read out storms hit East Coast. And that is what the person is going to be clicking on, because if you look at it, the role provided is link. So you're able to associate your link with a different kind of HTML object, which forms a little more meaningful content for the end user. Now, understanding semantics. Now, if you look at this teapot, this is one of the most loved examples that I found when I was going through a series of accessibility podcast by the name of Alicast. Uh, the example here is pretty powerful because if you look at a teapot, and when you buy a teapot, it does not come with a user manual, so to say, right? It is pretty obvious when you look at a teapot as to how it would behave. It comes with a handle, spout, a lid. You pour liquid, hold it with the handle, tilt it, the spout will actually pour the liquid out. And that is exactly what semantics is. You need not elaborate, you need not explain things. It should be very intuitive the way it behaves. Let's look at again examples of how we typically go wrong when you look at a fancy design. Now, if you look at the search box, it's got curved edges. Probably a very trivial example, but this will help you understand how we complicate things for ourselves. Now, instead to achieve a simple search button, just to get much more closer to the design that has been used for this, a person would end up using a div tag, for example. Right now, to make it behave like a button or accessibility tree to understand it like a button, we add an additional aria tag called as role equal to button. Now, when you start navigating using the keyboard alone, you realize that div being a presentation object or a generic object does not get focus. So you end up adding a tab index on top of it. Now, when you hit a space bar, a div won't behave, or if you hit a enter, it won't behave the way a button would. So you add additional attributes of on key down just to make it behave like what you want a button to behave. Now, instead of adding all these complications, you might as well use a button. Isn't that going to be much more straightforward? Now, obviously, there are, if you look at the heading, it says not ARIA tags. And this is where I'm trying to highlight that we unnecessarily complicate our code as well. Just assuming that it's important to give elements like role and so on and so forth. But it's not necessary when you're actually using semantic markup. It kind of solves a bunch of problems for you upfront. Now, you would say, button does not necessarily look like, a button tag would not necessarily render something like what we are trying to achieve here. But that is not true. CSS today is equally powerful. And you would end up seeing that, pretty much the same CSS gives you, more or less the same output like what it would give for a div tag, right? You'd probably end up writing a little more trying to get it to display inline block, but the CSS pretty much renders the same kind of buttons. So the hypothesis that you need to create a non-semantic markup to achieve a design does not hold true anymore, and it actually eases your life a lot more. Similarly important to consider is the tab index part of it. Now, tab index typically comes with three values. As you would all know, it comes with a negative, 1, or 0, and anything above 0. And it's typically used for gaining focus or removing focus from particular HTML objects. This is used more or less for elements which are either modal windows or navigation structure like you're seeing here. Now, there is a JavaScript library which is very simple to use called as inert.js. If you look at this navigation, if you look at the level 1 objects, your about, admissions, and academics, you would ideally want the navigation to flow in that sequence. And every time you hit on enter or a space bar, you would want the sub menu to open and thereby all subsequent tabs to go into the sub menus. Now, this is again made possible if you're using inert.js. What it would do is the moment you hit enter on about, all the subsequent child elements would start getting a tab index of 0 so that your keyboard starts getting focus on those elements. The moment you close it, it reverts it back to a tab index of -1 so that you can further navigate only on your L1 menus. This is again a very handy thing to do. You can probably do it yourself. Otherwise, you can use a similar inert.js library. A special thing on making sure that you're not using a positive tab index, because it breaks the flow of how sequence, how a normal tab index sequence will work. So it's generally a no-no. Avoid any positive tab indexes unless you are having specific use cases of how to build a modal, for example, right? Moving on, this is a very user-friendly hack. If you put it in your console, it will start highlighting all the elements that your keyboard is getting focus on, helping you understand and helping you understand how your document is actually structured. Moving on, this is again a myth. We generally have conversations around different viewports that we support when we are creating a responsive design. More so, we talk about cases where our client does not necessarily want a responsive layout or does not want to support a mobile device. He's happy looking at responsive at a tablet or a desktop mode. He wants a different, application for mobile users. But it's important to understand that responsive layout is equally important to support accessibility. The moment a person with a blurred vision or a little impaired vision generally zooms in a lot more to understand and read content. And the moment the person starts zooming in, if the site is responsive, it beautifully wraps around a single column, making it easy for the person to read through the content. If not, he would end up struggling to look at what he's reading by having to scroll both horizontally and vertically. So, the myth being responsive is just an ask to make sure you're supporting multiple devices. Not necessarily. It is also an important ingredient to make sure that you're supporting accessibility as well. Moving on. Now that we've spoken so much about accessibility, what do we do now? Let's look at what are the other providers doing to help, improve accessibility for users. This is what a bunch of hardware companies are doing. These are the different hardware devices that are available to help support accessibility. If you look at the first image on the top left, this is a keyboard specifically designed for people who are difficulty using the normal keyboard or have only one hand to navigate through. The second image that you see is people who are not able to use their hands at all. The stick that you see actually has a mouth clip on the other hand, so a person can put it inside the mouth and navigate or press the keys on the keyboard using the stick that you see. The third is an automatically refreshing braille keyboard. So in case the person is visually impaired and hard of hearing and is not able to use the screen reader as well, this is what is used, which is called as the electronic braille keyboard. So it reads what is being displayed on the screen and it prints it on this dynamic keyboard, which is what the blind users can use. There are many hearing aids which are available that enhance hearing. The one above that is called as a sip and a puff switch. This can be configured by having different intensities of puffs, and that can be calibrated using different for different actions on the keyboard. This is heavily used by people who are partially paralyzed, can't use their hands, can't move around much, but are able to use the mouth to blow in and probably take sips alongside, and those motions can be configured differently on the keyboard. So if you see, there is already a lot that the hardware organizations are doing. So what can we do? We need to make sure that we are making software which are compatible and enhance the user experience of the ones that are probably partially disabled or are specially abled, so to say. One of the things that I've started doing is I've stopped using mouse on Thursdays, which is what I call as a no mouse day. There is complete organization dedicated trying to ask users to follow this. The idea being, the more you start using the mouse or avoid using the mouse, you would start appreciating the challenges that people go through if you don't provide keyboard access only. This is one of the very small steps that you can do, but goes a long way in ensuring proper user experience for everybody along. Just to sum it up, one of the key messages that I would want to leave you all with is to make sure that you understand that accessibility is not about standards. It's not about compliance. It is AA, AAA. It's not about all that. It is about people, right? So don't look at accessibility as an afterthought. Look at accessibility as a means to providing a platform or an app which is equal for everybody to use. So with that thought, thank you, and we are up for questions. Thanks a lot.